Good evening, everyone. So the sun does shine in Melbourne, yes? Beautiful day. We're going to be looking tonight at diabetes and high blood pressure. Looking at high blood pressure, we'll be looking at, of course, the heart. The number one killer in Australia today, is heart disease. It's actually neck to neck with cancer. We touched on cancer last night, so we'll be looking at the other number one, which is heart disease / high blood pressure, and also diabetes. Now, I've only got 45 minutes here with you, but you will find that very similar principles are affecting both of them. And Hippocrates, one of them, his most quoted statements is, let food be your medicine and medicine be your food. So what I'd like to look at is how food affects diabetes and high blood pressure. And never in the history of mankind have human beings eaten so many carbohydrates. So let's do an assessment of the carbohydrates that Australians are eating. And no matter where I go in the world, in America, in Scotland, in England, in New Zealand, it's the same. So most people have cereal for breakfast. We know because there's a whole aisle devoted to it, and also bread. There's a whole aisle devoted to bread. And if you go into the supermarket and see a whole aisle devoted to something, you've got a pretty good idea that it's a hot topic, eh? It's something that a lot of people buy. And cake shops abound, cakes, biscuits, so we'll say cakes, etc. And pies, Australians love their pies. Pizzas, Italians have introduced Aussies to pizza and pasta. I'm a fifth generation Australian, Scottish descent. I didn't know what pasta was till I was about 18. I don't think there's a home without pasta today. Rice is another carbohydrate. I'm married to an Irishman, so every main meal must contain potatoes. Michael and I went to Scotland last year, 2017 in June, and Michael was so happy because we ate in English pubs, and in the food there's about 3 or 4 different types of potatoes. Lots of potatoes. They have lots of veggies too, that's why we could eat there. And last and certainly least in nutritive value is the pure crystallized acid that's extracted from the sugarcane plant. Would you agree with me? Aussies are high carbohydrate consumers. Now, all of these foods in the gastrointestinal tract, which I will show you tomorrow night, they break down to a singular structure called glucose. So when these foods get broken down to glucose, the glucose gets into the blood, and then it goes on the main highway straight to the project manager, which is called liver. And we're going to look at that a little bit in the next lecture. But the liver sends it, first of all, to the CBD, Central Business District of the human body. And that glucose goes into the cell. And when the glucose goes into the cell, it goes under the action of insulin. Insulin is the key that unlocks the door to get glucose into the cell. It then goes through a 20-step pathway, 20 little chemical reactions, which delivers to us 2 units of energy. The end result of this 20-step pathway is a chemical form of glucose called pyruvate. Pyruvate, as the chemical form of glucose, gets fed into what's often called the powerhouse. Called the powerhouse because even though it's only an 8-step pathway, it delivers to us a whopping 36 units of energy. So what makes the difference? How come an 8-step pathway gives us 36 and a 20-step pathway only gives us 2? The difference is oxygen. So this is what's often called an aerobic pathway, meaning it uses oxygen to produce energy. Whereas this pathway is called anaerobic. Anaerobic meaning no oxygen. It actually produces energy by the process of fermentation. So the first place that the glucose is sent is to the cell to be burnt as fuel. That's not a surprise. But on a high carbohydrate diet, there's still a lot of glucose left over. And so now the liver causes some of it to be stored in the cell like a little bunch of grapes, but they're little molecules of glucose, and they're stored there for when we need them. And they're called glycogen. Glycogen is a name given to quick-release glucose stores. This explains why when you wake up in the morning and do your morning exercise, you don't need to eat first. You will get energy because inside your cell, particular muscle cell, there are little molecules of glucose just waiting to be plucked when the need arises. But on a high carbohydrate diet, we've still got glucose left over. And so now the liver causes that excess glucose to be stored in the most amazing fuel depot in the human body, fat. And on this high carbohydrate diet, what's happening to Australians? They're getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Fat doesn't make you fat. I've just given you the basic science here. What makes you fat? It's the glucose. It's the carbs. And here we've got our pancreas. And our pancreas, it releases two hormones. One is insulin, and insulin's the hormone designed to get the blood glucose down again when it goes high. And if it goes down, if the blood glucose goes too low, then glucagon is released. And glucagon is the hormone that's released if blood glucose goes too low to get it up again. Now what's happening with the pancreas is when the pure crystallized acid extracted from the sugarcane plant goes in, blood glucose levels rise dramatically. Not sugarcane, because in the sugarcane, the glucose is all bound up in fibre and it slowly releases the glucose. But that pure crystallized acid that's been extracted from the sugarcane plant, when it goes into the body, blood glucose levels go boom. Very quickly the brain says, overload, quick. Pancreas, release the insulin. You see, high glucose demands high insulin. And so now the insulin's released and blood glucose levels start to drop, because now the insulin causes the glucose to go into the cell or to be stored as glycogen or fat. But because there was so much glucose, huge amounts of insulin are released. So where are blood glucose levels going now? Too low. That's called hypoglycemia, too low. So now the brain goes, oh no, we're too low. Stop the insulin, release the glucagon. But by the way, what happens down there? What does the person do? I need a hit of sugar. I'm too low. Will the sugar get it up? Oh, absolutely. Boom! Oh no, we're too high. Stop the glucagon, release the insulin. Oh no, can you see what's happening? Something else is happening. The cell starts to say, I'm sick of the sight of your insulin. And insulin resistance sets up. I'm sick of the sight of you. So the cell starts to resist insulin. And the blood glucose levels stay high because it's resisting getting in. And so the brain says, too much glucose, more insulin, more insulin. Can you see what's happening here? The body says, what am I going to do with this? Get it out through the urine. Do you know what diabetes mellitus means? Sweet urine. Because there's nowhere else for it to go. And then eventually the pancreas just says, I'm sick of this. I'm done. And it just stops releasing the insulin. We had a young man named Paul do our program. He was 19. He had type 1 diabetes, and he'd had type 1 diabetes since he was 15, where he was put on a very strong course of antibiotics for a chest infection and it started to kill off the beta cells in his pancreas that produce insulin. There can be several causes. He came to us. He was actually quite overweight for a young man. You see, high insulin, insulin's got a one-track mind. I must store, I must store, I must store. I've got to get it out of the blood and store. It's very hard to lose weight if someone's on high insulin. So he was on 90 units of insulin a day. He came to our program. He heard the lecture on how the carbohydrates, they're the ones that dump as glucose, get the blood sugar level too high. First 2 days at Misty Mountain Health Retreat, our guests have juices, mostly carrot, celery and apple juices. In the middle of the night, his blood sugar started to drop. What does that mean? He's on too much insulin. So the first week, he would have a lolly. That would get the blood sugar level up again, but he'd always get a headache because it'd go boom. Oh. Second week, he got convicted he shouldn't have the lolly. He was a quiet guy. I didn't know what was happening in the middle of the night. Second week, he decided to eat an apple. It takes a long time to eat an apple in the middle of the night. And to get the blood sugar level up, but he wouldn't get the headache. Third week, instead, if he got a blood sugar level low, he wouldn't take a lolly, he wouldn't take an apple, he'd jump down on the floor and he'd do 30 push-ups. And it'd get the blood sugar level up. Where'd that come from? His glycogen stores already sitting in his muscle cell. In fact, he told me he got up one morning, his blood glucose levels were 3.5. That's nearly passing out. He took that bit of salt, put it on his tongue, had a glass of water, went to the bathroom, had another glass of water, put his joggers on and went for a run, running up and down hills. Came back, took his blood glucose levels, 9. Where'd that come from? His glycogen stores, and if they ran out, he's got more. It's called fat stores. That's what the liver can do. It's called gluconeogenesis, producing glucose from fat stores. He said to me in the third week, he said, why didn't anyone tell me about glycogen? Glycogen. It's the diabetic's best kept secret. Notice what releases it, making sure you're well hydrated, exercising. By the end of the third week, he dropped his insulin by 90%. He was eating a very low carbohydrate diet. So what was he eating? Lots of vegetables. Legumes, every meal. Brown rice, whole grain spelt flour. He was an excited young man. He did 2 weeks program and 2 weeks in the garden, so he was with us for 4 weeks. He was so excited. So number one cause of diabetes is refined sugar. Did you know that there was no diabetes on the planet till sugar was well established? But something else has come along. And you will find that most of these foods are made out of it. It's the hybridized wheat. The hybridized wheat, how could that be? In the 1950s, wheat went through intensive crossbreeding. You see, they wanted to produce a plant with a high yield of grain to help with the starvation crisis in Africa, in India, in Mexico. And they they created one. Now, this plant only grows that high. When I was a little girl and you went out west, the wheat was that high. It's not that high anymore. It's only this high. It has to be this high, because if it stayed that high before the heavy yield was ripe, the stalk broke. So they had to create one that only grew about 2 foot with a thick stem to hold the heavy yield of grain. 1969, Dr. Norman Bourlag got a Nobel Prize for his hybridized wheat. 1970, notice the time frame, 1970, this wheat went worldwide. So by the 1990s, every cereal, bread, cake, pie, pizza, pasta, what's it made out of? The hybridised wheat. But what was never addressed was the effect of that hybridised wheat on the gut. So what I want to show you now is what it did to the starch. That's where it's particularly pertinent in the area of diabetes. And as you'll see, heart disease. So amylopectin A is the name of the starch that was created in the hybridisation process. And amylopectin A gets the blood sugar level up very high, very fast, and then a corresponding low. Let me give you something to compare it with. Amylopectin B is found in bananas and potatoes, and if you're familiar with bananas and potatoes on the glycemic index, they're fairly high. So the bananas and the potatoes, the amylopectin B, it's not as quick, not as high, not as fast. You see that? Actually not as low either, so we'll go up about there. So that's your B and that's your A. Something else to compare it to is amylopectin C. Amylopectin C is found in legumes. That's chickpeas, lima beans, black-eyed beans, cannellini beans. That gives a nice steady rise, maintains a nice steady deliverance, and then a nice steady drop. What does every cell in our body want? It wants a steady delivery of fuel. Understanding what amylopectin A does, let me show you how this affects the glycemic index. Are you familiar with the glycemic index of foods? That's how quickly the glucose in the food is released into the blood. Let me give you your baseline is 55. So anything under 55, glycemic index, is considered low. So your cherries are about 26. Grapefruit, that sits at about 25. So people with diabetes, they're good fruits because they're low GI, slow release of glucose. Sugar. Where does sugar sit? Whether it's white or brown or tan or dark brown, it's 59. Now that's not a surprise. Now your white bread, white cereals, so let's say the white wheat, the refined wheat, it sits at 69. Do you know what that means? A slice of white bread will get the blood sugar level up higher than a lolly. Why? It's because of the amylopectin A. Remember that type of starch that was created in the intensive crossbreeding? I'm glad you're sitting down because the next piece of information is shocking. Wholemeal. Wholemeal wheat, 72. How could that be? Well, because it's not refined, it has more amylopectin A in it. Can you see that? Do you know what that means? That wholemeal bread on your glycemic index is even worse than white. Now, please don't quote me as saying Barbara says white bread's better than brown, okay? Please. Regarding the gut, the wholemeal's better because you got the fibre, you got more B vitamins, but regarding the starch. When I presented this at one of our health retreats, a lady began to cry. I said, "Why are you crying?" She said, "I'm a diabetic. I'm type 2 diabetes. I was diagnosed at 65. I'm now 69. I do everything they tell me. I have wholemeal bread, wholemeal pasta. I have wholemeal cereal. And every 6 months I go to the doctor and he puts me on more insulin. And what's the definition of insanity? To do what you've always done and expect different results." She said, "I'm crying tears of joy because you have just solved the puzzle. And I'm crying tears of frustration because I don't do what the lady down the road does. She has chocolates and lollies and pizza and cheesecakes. I don't do that." What's every diabetic told to eat? Whole grain? Whole grain bread? Whole grain cereal? Why? Why? What does Australia grow a lot of? Wheat. So what are they going to tell you? Eat wheat. And so this is explaining that this is not an epidemic, this is a pandemic. Do you know what it said on the news 2 weeks ago? Every 4 minutes in Australia, another diabetic is diagnosed. That's crazy. And if you look at that time frame, by the 1990s, all the wheat we're eating is hybridised. So we're looking at one of the first two things you've got to stop to conquer diabetes, and that is the refined sugar and the hybridised wheat. So what do you eat? Spelt. Spelt is, and on Friday night when I look at the acid alkaline, I'm going to show you what happened to the gluten structure of the wheat. But spelt and kamut, they have not been hybridised, so they don't contain that amylopectin I. If you want to pursue this a little bit more, there's a book called Wheat Belly by Dr. William Davis, and he explores this subject and will explain it to you. So there are some things that you've got to stop to control diabetes. And these two head the list, plus caffeine. Caffeine gets an insulin response. One of the reasons why some diabetic nurses aren't advising that, because what are they drinking themselves? Dairy. Now, I'm not talking about Lulabelle in the paddock who's eating organic grass and gets milked and drunk. You know, that's been happening for centuries all through the northern European countries, and it hasn't caused diabetes. See, today, the milk is altered. Today, the cows are given... Do you know 80% of the antibiotics that are made go to animals? But what happens with the dairy when it breaks down in the gut, and the current figures, this was in the newspaper, that 60% of Australians cannot handle dairy. Now, if we change that to organic raw milk, it'd bring it down to probably 30%. They can't break down those large globules in their gut. And so what's happening is molecules are getting into the blood that shouldn't be in there. Let's say the molecules that are broken down from the dairy look like that. So what happens now? The body creates antibodies. Let's say this is an antibody to actually wipe that out. So they wipe out the antibodies, and then they look across, and the beta cells in the pancreas have a similar structure. So these antibodies that were created to wipe out those molecules broken down from the dairy, they come over and start wiping out the beta cells in the pancreas. And it is in that way that the dairy is contributing to the diabetes. How many people in Australia wake up to those four? Isn't it true that many do? Not realising the danger. Many are sick through ignorance. So to conquer diabetes, these four things have to stop. Number two, another important point in conquering diabetes is hydration. The hardest time to drink water is in the cold weather, is that right? Well, boil the kettle and make it hot water. Put a squeeze of lemon with it. You just got to find out some way to get it in. Because your pancreas needs water to make these hormones that control your blood glucose levels. In fact, if someone's blood glucose levels are going down and they take a glass of water, do you know that will cause a release, or the body to help release some of the glucose to bring it up a little bit. But not only hydration, which is approximately 8 glasses a day, but also salt. Now, it is at this point that I'd like to explain salt, because this will also help with the blood pressure. So your seawater has 92 minerals, and of those 92 minerals, 30% is sodium. Can you see how God meant us to be having sodium with all the other minerals to buffer it out? 50% is chloride. And because these make up the largest amount of minerals, when the first crystals are formed, when the seawater's evaporated, when the water's evaporated from the seawater, sodium chloride. So they scoop that up, no time to wait for the rest to be evaporated. Bleach it white, put aluminium with it, there's your table salt. Table salt has 2 minerals. Yes, it is true that table salt will help the blood pressure to go up because it causes a mineral imbalance in and out of the cell. You see, the highest concentration of mineral inside the cell is potassium, and the highest concentration outside the cell is sodium. So when these are taken in these high amounts, it causes an imbalance. The doctor's right. Table salt will get the blood pressure up. And so will no salt, because your cells need that little bit of salt. So my suggestion is to take the Celtic salt. The Celtic salt contains 82 minerals, and the Himalayan salt, it contains 75 minerals. One of the beauties of the Celtic salt is it has 3 magnesiums, and magnesium is a muscle relaxant, and magnesium relaxes that heart at rest. Dr. Lee Langry is a French doctor who's written a whole book on salt. If someone comes to him with high blood pressure, he puts them straight on Celtic salt. If they're not used to any salt, start small, start very small, and then little by little ease it in. In Matthew chapter 5 verse 13, it says in the Bible, "Ye are the salt of the earth. If the salt hath lost its savour, wherewith shall it be salted? It is henceforth good for nothing but to be cast out and trodden under foot of men." Old English, how I love the Old English. What does it mean, the salt hath lost its savour? I'd like to suggest to you that table salt has lost its savour. It's lost all the other minerals. And what does the Bible say? It's now good for nothing but to be cast out and trodden under foot of men. So stop the refined salt. So you can see how the high blood pressure and the diabetes, they sort of lapping over here because the same things affect them all. What else is important is exercise. Specifically, the high-intensity interval training. The high-intensity interval training are intervals of high intensity. So the high intensity, most of the research shows 30 seconds. That's not long. Did you try it today? Most of the research has been done on exercise bikes. Exercise bikes easy, you're holding on if you're a little unstable. If you've got knee, joint, ankle, hip, the exercise bike is a lot easier. We went cycling this afternoon. Such fun. 30 seconds high intensity and then a recovery time of about 90 seconds, and that is usually done for a cycle of 6. That's your ideal. If you can't do that, that's perfectly fine. Just work up to it. If your high intensity is 7 seconds and if your recovery is about 10 minutes, that's perfectly fine. You just start with where you're at. Now what this does, it increases the circulation of the blood to the skin in a mighty way, but not only the skin, to the pancreas. It increases the circulation of the blood to the heart. It actually strengthens that heart muscle. And when you do the exercise, you cause the blood to come out to the extremities, which takes pressure off the heart. And it strengthens the heart. So you cannot conquer high blood pressure unless you exercise. You cannot conquer diabetes unless you exercise. You just got to find out what works well for you. If you can't do the exercise bike, the easiest is the rebounder. If your balance isn't good, grab onto a chair, grab onto something. And if you can't bounce, just start with this, just little tiny jigging. Just start where you're at. If that seems over the top for you, that's all right, you're not there yet. Might be there, it might take you 6 months or a year. You don't have to do that now. But you just start where you're at. I love that piece of information the lady gave us. Walking for half an hour after every meal. Did you get that? Reduces diabetes by 50%. Diabetes is a lifestyle disease. It's not genetics, and it's not the germ. It's actually what you do to your body. Even if you were born with a weakened pancreatic gene, you need never go there. You need never pull the gun. Most people don't realise the dramatic effect these things have on the body. Your cells are reviving and recharging while you sleep. And the hours of power are between 9 p.m. and 2 a.m. unless you're happening to be attending a seminar for a week. So it won't hurt for you to miss half an hour for 1 week. I think it's only, only a couple of weeks, and it'll be 10 and 3 because of daylight saving. These are the hours your batteries recharge. These are the hours that healing intensifies. This is the hours where your brain does a little bit of house cleaning. So conquering anything in your body, no matter what it is, it's important to sleep in those hours, except for this week. So that's where we should be sleeping. Can't sleep, just lie there, have all the lights off, and thank God for all the wonderful things in your life. One lady said, I haven't got any wonderful things. I said, I notice you've got 2 legs. I met a man with no legs. There's always something to be thankful for. And I'm sure you sleep in a comfortable bed every night. You're not out in a ditch and it's pouring rain and a car just ran over you. You know, there's always something to be thankful for, isn't there? My friend's got an orphanage in Africa. When we visited a few years ago, I said to the kids, do you like it here? They said, yeah, we've got a bed. A bed. They haven't got a pillow, they've got a bed. They're so happy. Are you happy that you've got a bed? It's all relative, isn't it? There's one thing that will stop you sleeping. Two things, actually. Blue light, screens. Don't allow yourself to touch them in those hours. You've got study to do. We'll do it at 3 in the morning. And the other thing is getting annoyed. If you get annoyed with the fact that you cannot sleep, you will not sleep. That's why you've got to lie there and have the attitude of gratitude. Thank you, Father in heaven, that I cannot sleep. Now, Seddon Church have graciously allowed me to speak on Saturday morning. And at 9:30, I think it is, on Saturday morning, I'm going to show you how you can rewire your brain. I'm going to show you how your brain can get younger as you get older. Doesn't that sound good? So you can rewire it. But doesn't cholesterol cause heart disease? Do you know there's no proof? No proof? No proof that saturated fat and cholesterol cause heart disease. If you find it, please email me. You see, the liver makes cholesterol, and the liver makes cholesterol according to the body's demands. In fact, Dr. Malcolm Kendrick, he's a cardiologist, he wrote a book called The Great Cholesterol Con. He's scathing in that book on this so-called theory. It's a myth that saturated fat and cholesterol cause heart disease. There's no proof. In fact, Ansel Keys in 1953 first put forth the theory. And in his own words, he said, we're pretty sure the research will come. Well, it's 2018 and it still hasn't come. So what did they do to get heart disease to reduce? Stop the fat. Has it helped? No. Stop the butter and eat margarine. Has that reduced heart disease? No. I know put everyone, as many as possible, on cholesterol-lowering medication. Has that stopped heart disease? Nope. It's still the number one killer. Your brain loves fat, it loves cholesterol, and the fattiest and highest cholesterol food on the planet is breast milk. Are they going to ban that? And a baby's having heart attacks? The baby must have that, otherwise the brain won't develop properly. Your liver makes cholesterol according to the needs. And in my next lecture, when I talk about the liver, I'm going to explore that more detail. I'll have more time in my next lecture. I've made some fairly wild statements there, but I'm going to give you a lot of proof in my next lecture. I'm going to use science, I'm going to use common sense, and I'm going to use history. They're the three things that we can rely on. Because you've probably seen on the internet, you can find research to support anything, is that right? But you can't argue with history, you can't, hopefully, argue with common sense, and you've got basic science, and that's what I've shown you here, is the basic science. So let me tell you about Bobby Lieberman. He was a man in his 60s who came to our health retreat in Alabama. He said, I've spent $1 million on my health in the last 10 years. Not hard to do in America. He came to us, he was a little overweight and he was in a wheelchair. You see, recently the doctors had cut out some lymph nodes in his groin to try and find out why he had diabetes. I don't understand that. But because he'd flown to us, his legs were all swollen. He was in a wheelchair. He just spent a lot of money on expensive bandages. He was on medication for blood pressure. He was on medication for diabetes, 90 units of insulin a day, short and long acting. He was on cholesterol lowering medication. He was on blood thinning medication. So when he came to us, he said, anything you say, I will do. So I said, you won't need the bandages. And I got him to walk barefoot on the grass every morning, wonderful exercise for the feet. I got him to get on the rebounder for 1 minute every hour. It's the best lymphatic cleanser and mover, and that swollen legs were lymphatic fluid. He started to eat a very low carbohydrate diet. So what did he eat? Number 5 and 6. He ate high fibre. Where's your high fibre? All your plant foods are very high in fibre, particularly the vegetables. Generous amounts of protein. So every meal he had some legumes, he had some nuts, and he had some seeds. And he had healthy fats. What are healthy fats? They're fats as they came from the hand of the Creator. So there's your nuts and your seeds, and the 2 oils that are extracted from the flesh of the plant is your olive oil and your coconut oil. They're concentrated foods, you don't need much. Had a little bit with his meal. And basically all the food he was eating was low GI foods. So instead of potato, he'd have sweet potato. Instead of banana, he'd have cherries, grapefruit. He was very excited because he didn't use his bandages all week. He was starting to walk more and more. He was with us for 2 weeks. And at the end of the 2 weeks, he was on 10 units of insulin instead of 90. Just incredible. He emailed me 3 months later. He said, I'm off all my medication. All. He'd been diagnosed type 1 diabetes. He said, I'm off all my medication. He said, I'm eating a very low carbohydrate diet. He said, I eat a little. I'll have a little rice, I'll have a little millet. I have legumes every day. He said, I have breakfast like a king, lunch like a queen, and I don't eat at night. Did you hear that? He's a diabetic and he's eating 2 meals a day. And what do they tell you to eat? You'll see tomorrow night that the stomach likes to eat and then have a break. It doesn't like to eat all day long. He said, I am swimming 30 laps a day, 62. He said, I am cycling 6 miles a day and I rebound for about 3 times, for a few minutes 3 times a day. I'm drinking 2 litres of water a day. He said, my doctors are astonished. Spent $1 million in the last 10 years. Incredible. He conquered his high blood pressure. He conquered his diabetes. Just with these simple lifestyle changes. What an amazing body we live in. It can heal us if we give it the right conditions. So at 3 months, when he'd emailed me, he said, I've lost 20 kilos in weight. He said, it's like I'm not even on a diet. He said, I'm eating so well, I'm never hungry. As you'll see tomorrow night, these 3 foods keep the food in the stomach longer: your fibre, your protein and your fats. I'm going to give everyone a break now. When we come back after the break, we're going to be looking at the liver, your project manager. So please have a break. I think there are some drinks and teas.